So I have a challenge for you. I would like you to think about how you would describe humanity to an alien. So you have to imagine some sort of alien being that has never encountered a human before, doesn't know anything about Earth, and you had to tell them about us. In fact, Carl Sagan back in the 1970s was tasked with precisely this. Carl Sagan and a team of NASA scientists working with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory were charged with a task of describing humanity to an unknown alien civilization. What was happening in 1977, some of you might know, we launched the Voyager space probe. Now, the Voyager probe was designed to conduct experiments, I believe it was around the planet Saturn, but then to continue on into interstellar space, to leave our solar system. In fact, just 2021, August of 2021, Voyager became the first man-made object to leave our solar system. And now, the fine folks at NASA had an idea. They said, well, what if there is like extraterrestrial life out there? What if it's intelligent? We should use this opportunity to tell them something about us. And so on the Voyager space probe, they have what is called the Golden Record. Has anyone ever heard of this? It's so fascinating. So on the right hand, you see there's what looks like kind of your old vinyl records that we used to have. But encoded on this record are artifacts and things about humanity. And so Carl Sagan and his team, they tried to think really hard on what is it that makes humans humans, and how would we describe that? And there are 115 pictures that are encoded on this disc. There are greetings, human greetings spoken in 55 different languages. There are pictures of our technology and what a man looks like and what a woman looks like. And there's a picture of a human baby. And it's just a really interesting assortment of photographs that Carl Sagan and his team put on this disc. They put music, everything from Bach to Johnny B. Good, which is traveling through outer space, which is very satisfying. And they did this because they hoped one day, or perhaps were open to the possibility, that some sort of extraterrestrial species would find it. In fact, you can see on the cover on the left, they wrote instructions on decoding this message. And they even, in the bottom left, they wrote a map using pulsars to help these beings find Earth. Which is a great idea and also kind of terrifying. And it tells me that Carl Sagan's team never watched Independence Day. They were trying to answer a simple question. What is a human being? And they were so ingenious, and I'm amazed at kind of the cleverness of how they tried to convey that message. But I wonder if there's an even more fundamental question that Carl and his team would maybe struggle to answer as scientists, which is not the what of humanity, but if I could say the why of humanity. Like, how would you tell an alien what the purpose of a human being is? How could you help them understand what the full manifestation of a human being is? And in fact, this is precisely the question that the writer of Hebrews wrestles with in our passage this morning. If you have a Bible, we're going to be in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 5, and it begins this way. It says, "And furthermore, it is not angels who will control the future world we are talking about." Now, if you're just joining this conversation, you might be confused. You're like, wait, angels, where am I? What are we talking about today? But you have to know that to this point in Hebrews, the author has been trying to describe who Jesus is to us and the role that Jesus should occupy in our lives, which is namely first, that Jesus should be supreme in our lives, that we shouldn't allow anything else to compete with Jesus for greatness, including angels. And this was a challenge that the writer of Hebrews needed to address for his original audience. They were struggling with revering angels and even perhaps worshiping angels. And so the writer of Hebrews has been trying to tell us as much as he can about Jesus. He's been telling us the importance of not drifting away from the gospel that Jesus came to preach to us. And now we arrive at another question, which is on the mind of the writer of Hebrews, which is, who will control the future world? Now, the future world, what the writer of Hebrews is getting at here is maybe what we would, in fact, in other places in the New Testament, this is called the age to come, or literally the Greek says, in the world to come. So what is this world to come? And the New Testament writers look forward and they understand that the full Christian hope is resurrection life. It is a world after the end of human history has come to a close. It is a reality that when the faithful, people who have trusted Jesus, will be raised back to life and given resurrection bodies, which are physical in nature. And we see here that it's a world in which all of the wrongs that we experience on a daily basis have been righted. You know, for us, we have to remember that, again, for Christians, heaven is not the ultimate hope. It is resurrection, where we see that heaven comes down to earth. And so the question on the writer of Hebrews is, he's saying, okay, well, who's going to be in control of this new world? Who's going to be the boss in the world to come? Which I suppose is a good question. If we're going to be there for a while, we'd like to know who's in charge. And we learn right at the very beginning who's not in charge, which are angels. So it's not angels, it's not these powerful spiritual beings that have been created by God. They're not going to be in charge. And so that leaves the question, if not angels, then who? Now, to answer this question, our writer is going to go back into the Old Testament, like he's prone to do, to help understand and to help us understand from the Hebrew Scriptures what we are to think about this question. In fact, he goes back to Psalm 8, and if you want to flip that direction, I would invite you to turn back to that book of the Old Testament. It says, "For in one place the Scriptures say, 'What are mere mortals that you should think about them? Or a son of man that you should care for him? Yet for a little while you made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor. You gave them authority over all things.'" The answer to the question, who will control, who will be in authority in the world to come, is actually humans. Now, the way that the writer of Hebrews, he assumes that to answer this question, that you know a lot about Psalm 8. That you can recite it perhaps even from memory, and we're given just a couple of verses, but we're really supposed to take all of the meaning of Psalm 8 and we're supposed to apply it to this passage. And on the off chance you haven't had Psalm 8 memorized, let me just read for you how this psalm works, particularly how it begins. It says, "When I look at the night sky, and I see the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars you set in place." This psalm was written by David, and he had the experience that many of us have had when we've gone out on a night sky or a nighttime when there's no moon, and maybe you've ever gone to camping out in the wilderness or somewhere where there's not a lot of light pollution. And maybe you've had that experience that I've had where you lay back and you just look up at the stars. Have you ever done that? I remember one night I was camping back in Central Oregon. And we were staying on a houseboat, in fact, and I had decided to sleep out on the top of our houseboat. And I was curled up in my sleeping bag, and I turned around and I just looked up at the stars, and I had never seen anything quite like it. It was a dark night. There was no moon in the sky, and we were out in the middle of nowhere, so there weren't street lights adding to the pollution. And you could look up and you could just see it. It's like, oh, that's Jupiter. It was this red little flickering light. And you could see Saturn, and you could see the constellations that we know, the Big Dipper and Orion and all of those things. It was just absolutely amazing. But for me, what was even more captivating is that behind those constellations and those planets was the spiral arm of the Milky Way galaxy. And you're looking up at this, and it just seems so it is so awe-inspiring to think about that, and to think about the immensity of our solar system, and then the largeness of our galaxy. And it's even more interesting for me to think that David himself was looking up at that same night sky, probably feeling a lot like I was. But then I think about that David, as an ancient person, had no concept of the actual reality of our universe. The fact that the planet Earth is one of 9 planets in our solar system, and Pluto is a planet. And then our solar system revolved around a star, which, as large as our star is actually a fairly insignificant star compared to some of the other balls of gas in the sky. And to think that every one of those dots represented a sun or a star that probably had other planets. And to think about the fact that there are billions and billions of stars in the Milky Way galaxy. And then on top of that now, to have the scientific revelations that our galaxy is probably one of between 1 and 200 billion galaxies. And by the way, we just got a brand new telescope. It's going to tell us even more about our world. It's utterly awe-inspiring and humbling when we think about just the utter immensity of the universe. And then, of course, by definition and by extension, like the smallness of me. And so David is having this feeling that many of us have had when we've stared up at the stars and we say, wow. But what he's really most awestruck by is that in light of the bigness of the universe and the expansiveness of creation, it says, what are mere mortals? Who is man that you are mindful of him? Who are we? For a God who can speak all of this into creation through the power of his word, who are we that you would even think about us as insignificant as we are and transitory as think about a human life is in the context of something so massive as space? He says, I'm having a hard time understanding it, God, that you would be mindful of me and man, of mankind. But then he says this, you gave them, again, the Psalm 8 is all about humans. It says you gave them, humans, charge of everything you made, putting all things under their authority, the flocks and the herds and all of the wild animals and the birds in the sky, the fish in the sea, and everything that swims in the ocean currents. He says, in light of all that, I can't imagine that not only have you think about us, but you've placed all of this creation, at least in terms of planet Earth, under our authority, under the authority of human beings. And now, as you hear Psalm 8, if you're a Bible person, if you have a background, you might think of some other language in the Bible that this reminds you of. And if it sounds familiar, I would say if you just go right back to the first part of your Bible in Genesis chapter 1. You see that the writer of Psalm 8, David, is invoking the language and some of the ideas of the creation itself. He says, then God said, let us make human beings in our image to be like us. And they will reign over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and the livestock and all of the wild animals on the earth and the small animals that scurry along the ground. So God created human beings in his own image. And in the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Then God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and govern it. Reign over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and all of the animals that scurry along the ground. You almost hear that language that David is borrowing from. This comes right out of the book of Genesis. But what we really see here in Genesis is the why behind the what of humanity. Right, I gave you that challenge. If you were to tell some sort of extraterrestrial civilization about humans, not just what we are, but why we are, our purpose, you need only go to your Bible, cut out the first page, and put it in a rocket ship. Because you see here the purpose of humanity. And there are 3 things that Genesis tells us. The first aspect of our humanity and really our identity comes from the fact that we are image bearers. We are created in God's image, which is an astonishing thing to think about. But the noun, right, our identity implies the verb. Right? If we are image bearers, our job is to bear the image. It's to be an imager. It's to reflect God's glory. Just like the moon reflects the sun, we are to reflect God's glory back to him, but also into the world. That's our purpose. But then we also see there's several other things associated with that. The second thing, just put very directly, is to have babies. Right? We see that God creates a man and a woman, a male and female, and he places them together in a garden, right? Because only together can a man and woman fully reflect the image of God. But we also see a part of that oneness, we see out of that comes children. God says, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, right? Fill it with other humans. And then finally, we see, and when we read Psalm 8 and Hebrews 2 and Genesis 1 all together, we would be right to understand that there's an emphasis on ruling and reigning and exercising authority. And so we see that is the purpose of a human being. It's to reflect God's glory, to be an image bearer, to be fruitful, and to rule and to reign over this creation as God's representative on the earth. That's our purpose. Now let's go back to Hebrews, verse 8. It says, now, when it says all things, being the psalm, it means that nothing is left out. But we have not yet seen all things put under their authority, which is kind of a way to implicitly ask a question. Like when we look at our world today, and if we understand that our purpose is really derived from creation and that time in the Garden of Eden where Adam and Eve are in perfect relationship with God and humanity and nature, like he says, is that how things look today? Or is it broken? Of course, we know if you've turned on the news lately or maybe just lived 48 hours, you know that our world is extremely broken. And that the picture that we see in Genesis 1 is in fact not the reality that we are living in. It's a sad reality, but it is true nevertheless. And of course, we see the reason for that when we see Genesis 1 and 2, it's kind of this beautiful picture, but then of course Genesis 3 comes along. And in Genesis 3, we see brokenness. And we see sin enter the equation, and we see how it does two things. Sin corrupts God's creation, but it also corrupts human vocation. Right? When Adam and Eve sin, we see that curses are pronounced, but if you look carefully at the text, the curses actually fall on the creation itself. The ground is cursed. And the thing that God created to sustain human life is going to be in an adversarial relationship. Adam is going to toil now. He's going to have to work. He's going to have to scratch out a living so that he can survive. So we see that the creation is corrupted, but also human vocation. The purpose of humanity has been skewed and altered by their sin. And if you don't believe me, just think about this. What was our first job? It was to be an image bearer. It was to take God's image and to reflect it. Now, when the serpent comes into the equation, the temptation, if I may restate it in this way, is to bear your own image. Don't you want to be like God, knowing the difference between good and evil? And that temptation was so tantalizing that they gave into it. And so instead of worrying about reflecting God's image, we said, I'm going to bear my own image. I'm going to worship myself. I'm going to place myself at the center and not God. We also see that humans their purpose is to procreate. It's literally to create more people to fill the earth. But we barely make it to the turn of a page before we see Cain and Abel. In a fight and in a moment of jealousy, Cain kills Abel and wipes out a quarter of the human race. So instead of creating life, we've now destroyed it. And finally, our job is to rule. Our job is to exercise dominion over the earth. And so what we see here is now human history is written basically as one power struggle after another. One group dominating another. Instead of caring for the world that God has placed us in, we exploit it. for other purposes. And we've even lost the positive dimension of what it means to rule and to exercise dominion over. Those are negative words for us. If you don't believe me, just imagine for a moment that you showed up to work one day and you found that you had a new boss, and the director came in and said, "I'd like to introduce you to your new boss." And they stood up and they said, "Welcome, team. I have come to exercise dominion. I have come to rule over you." We'd be like, "Where's that HR number?" Would we not? Right? We don't even have a positive definition for the words that God used to give us our initial purpose and vocation. Ruling and having dominion was good. Leading the creation and caring for it was a part of God's original plan for us. We've corrupted even the definition of what God has asked us to do. And so we have corrupted God's creation, but also our vocation through sin. And so that's what we see when we look around. But then verse 9 says, "But what we do see is Jesus, who for a little while was given a position a little lower than the angels." That's a callback to Psalm 8. "And because he suffered death for us, he is now crowned with glory and honor," which is also a callback to Psalm 8. Yes, by God's grace, Jesus tasted death for everyone. God, for whom and through whom everything was made, chose to bring many children into glory. And it was only right that he should make Jesus, through his suffering, a perfect leader, fit to bring them into their salvation. Let's go back to the beginning. What we do see is Jesus. And when we see Jesus, what is it that we actually see? You know, many of us, we think about Jesus' divinity. And of course, Scripture tells us that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. That if we want to know what God is like, we look to Jesus. We see earlier on in Hebrews that Jesus is the perfect imprint. He's the perfect expression of who the Father is. He's the Word made flesh, and we see that in Jesus, and it helps us to understand really his divinity. But we also see in Jesus, and what this passage is actually asking us to look at is the humanity of Jesus. Notice here that through Jesus' death and resurrection, which is his glory and honor, it allows human beings to step into their glory and honor. And we know what's the honor and glory of human beings? It's to reflect God's image. It's to be fruitful and to multiply. It's to rule the earth. It's to fulfill our purpose and our identity. And so we see here that Jesus, through his death and resurrection, which was his glory, which was his way to pioneer, right, our way into salvation, which, remember, the ultimate goal of salvation is not for you to get to heaven, it's resurrection life. And Jesus did that. So what is this saying? This is actually a story about reclaiming and redeeming humanity. We understand now what God's heart is and what his purpose is for his human beings, his human creation. And so what is Jesus doing? He is entering into humanity, not to, think about this, not to get humanity out, but rather to get humanity in. So Jesus, we think about this from the wrong way, I think. We look at Jesus, we say, "Oh, Jesus, man, he's just like a superhuman." We even have a little song in kids' church that, "Jesus, you're my superhero." No one? Okay, you just left me hanging out there all by myself. So we look at Jesus as a superhuman, and here's what I want to say. Jesus was not a superhuman. The amazing thing about Jesus is that he was fully human. And so that in Jesus, we see the mystery of Jesus is that he is fully God and he is fully human. And so when we look at Jesus, not only do we see a picture of our Father, but we actually see what humanity was created to be. And a lot of us, we think of ourselves as human, that the sad reality is that we are subhuman. None of us are living out the purpose and the picture that God has for us at the very beginning. And so that's why That's why Jesus comes into humanity. That's why we need to be saved by Jesus, right? And if we think about this, one of the common kind of cultural undercurrents that I see today would be called secular humanism. And I'll be honest, when I hear really eloquent humanists speak, it's so optimistic, and it's even noble how they look at humanity. And you've ever heard that phrase, and it's usually after a story of like a little child doing something nice for like an old lady or something. They say, faith in humanity restored. The sad part of humanism is that it believes that the problem and the solution are both the same thing. And I will tell you, if the problem is humanity, and if you've noticed, we have a problem, like whenever you gather humans together, there's problems. We can't look to humans to be the solution to the problem of humanity. And so Jesus comes into humanity to what? To redeem our humanity. He's not trying to get us like out of here and let's leave this because the world is going to hell in a handbasket, right? So let's go to heaven. That's not the story. That's a part of the story. And you should be glad that when you die, if you are a believer, you will be immediately with Christ. But the final story is right back here. Resurrection life, where we are reigning and ruling alongside Jesus. And in fact, the rest of this passage talks about how we become brothers and sisters of Jesus. And how together we are going to fulfill the mandate that we have abandoned back in the garden. We are going to restore that and redeem that in the future. But here's why I think resurrection life is so exciting, and here's why I think it matters. It's because if resurrection life is going to be both familiar to us and different, it'll be familiar in the sense that we will be on some sort of restored earth. And I don't know what that means. But it does mean it'll be here. It means we will have a reality that is familiar to us. We will, if we look at Jesus, we will have friendships and relationships. That means in the resurrection, like I'm going to know you. You're going to know me, and we're going to be able to think about our time together. At least that's what I see in Jesus. And so as we think about that, it's not some sort of disembodied spiritual existence, right? Because remember how many times your kids have said, like, what are we going to do in heaven? And you say, well, we're going to, just float around and be with Jesus. And the kids they say exactly what we're thinking. Like, that doesn't sound like any fun, right? Won't we get bored? And who knows, maybe we will. But what I believe is that, Scripture teaches, we will ultimately be reborn. We will be resurrected back here on earth. And we will get to then experience the life that we were created to live. So here's how this gets really, really practical. Let me try to bring this back because I know we've been flying at 40,000 feet here. When we go back to our purpose, and when we see the image that we have in the garden, there are two things that jump out to me that are almost surprising, but now I can't see it any other way. When we're talking about ruling in the world to come, we look at Genesis to see a picture of what that might be. And the two things we see in this unbroken, perfect creation with Adam and Eve in perfect harmony with everything, we see two things. We see that Adam and Eve both have a job, and we see that they have a family. Now, how do we express our purpose as humans? We do it in the context of a job and our family. Let's look at a job. When we see that Adam and Eve are placed in the garden, you would think that in a perfect world, you just sit back and let the things take care of themselves, right? You're drinking coconuts and things just happen, and I just like coconuts. It's a thing. You assume that the world would just run itself. But that's not the story. Actually, Adam and Eve are placed in the garden, and God says they began to work the garden. That was their job. It was in some way, shape, or form, in concert with and in partnership with the creation itself. Their job was still to order and to create and to cultivate. Now, it gets me thinking, that job was a job that would have never ended. That's so different than how we view work, isn't it? We view our work as a ball and chain, as the 9 to 5, as the thing we have to punch in and punch out of, and hopefully as soon as possible retire from, right? That's how we view work. And that's a broken view of work. In fact, when we look at the gospel and how it shapes what we do, we start to see that there are little glimpses of resurrection life in our work. There are those things where, do you ever have a moment where it's like, man, when I'm just doing this, like someone has to drag me away from it. Whether it's something you get to build, or whether you're an artist and you paint, or you're doing something, and when you do that, it gives you joy. You know, some people have a gift where they get to organize people's closets. Do you know that is a job? And it gives them joy because you know what? It brings order where there was chaos. Some of you have this gift of working with numbers and making sense of spreadsheets, and you say, you know what? I get to establish an order that helps my business grow. And you are called accountants, and I don't understand you, but I'm so grateful for you. Right? So what are we seeing here? We're seeing care. We're seeing creation. We're seeing cultivation. You're not just managing a spreadsheet. You're cultivating. You're not just building a house, you're creating something. And I have a theory that's that stuff that we're going to do in the resurrection. Your gifts, your passions, the things that give you joy, they're going to give God joy as you express them. They're going to give other people joy as you express them. And we're going to be working together to rule over this world. Let's talk about family. It's always amazing to me that God works exclusively in the context of families. He creates Adam and Eve and he brings them together and the two become one flesh, which is the definition of a family. And this family produces children, and these children eventually, we see another family, right, with Noah and his family. Ultimately, we see Abraham and his family that eventually leads to the family of Israel. Even in the New Testament, we see Paul tells us that the community of faith is a family. And we are grafted into this family when we believe in Jesus. God works exclusively through families. And so how do we reclaim the picture of families that is quickly broken after the fall? I think we do two things. We bring the kingdom into our family. So for you live, I don't know anything about you, but I know you live in a broken family. And it's broken in different ways, in different degrees, but it's broken. So how do we manifest our purpose? Well, we bring the kingdom into our family. So where there is division, we bring unity. Where there is dysfunction, we bring grace. Where there is estrangement, we bring a step closer. We also work to bring our family into the kingdom. And for us, particularly if you have children or grandchildren, this is a statement about us trying to instill faith into our children. To try to help foster a relationship with Jesus that will ultimately sustain them and save them. And so why? Well, because that's our purpose. It's to fill the earth with other image bearers. It's about helping to bring unity and cohesion where there is dysfunction. And so as we see this, we ultimately see Jesus, who saw the brokenness of the world, and instead of stepping back, he stepped in to become a human so that he could help us become a human being. It's a beautiful picture. And I hope that as we step into this, that you will also allow God to help step you into a greater realization of your humanity. Let's bow and pray this morning. God, we thank you for today. We're just in awe, like the psalmist was, as he looked up in the sky and he saw the galaxy and the immensity of our universe. We are aware of just how massive and how big you are and how insignificant we are. And yet, you are mindful of us. You see us and you care for us. And you've given us a purpose. God, we also know that due to our own disobedience, we have corrupted that purpose. We have lost our true vocation. God, we understand we did that because we ultimately rejected you as our Father. And so, God, today we are so grateful that we can look to Jesus. We see him in his divinity, in his representation, his perfect representation of you. We see him as the Word made flesh. But God, we also today see Jesus as the perfect embodiment of humanity. We recognize that Jesus was not a superhuman, rather he was simply fully human. And how beautiful of a picture that is. We're grateful that he perfectly bore the image. We're grateful of how he lived in community and how he fostered and cared for a spiritual family. And God, we're also grateful for how Jesus manifests power and how he showed us what it meant to rule. And of course, we see that Jesus' greatest power, his greatest moment of triumph was him laying his life down for his friends. And so God, today, help us to see Jesus. Help us to appreciate his humanity. Help us to allow Christ to redeem our humanity through his death on the cross. His glory for our glory, his honor for ours. And so God, we thank you that we can look to Jesus and that we can reach out and that we can be near to you because of what he did for us. We thank you for all these things. It's in Jesus' name we said, amen.